Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors here at 𝐶𝐤𝐲 Church, and I'm here with my buddy, my pal, my partner in crime, Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Guilty as charged. Yeah, it's good.
Good.
I'm doing well. It's cold outside, which makes me happy because it means it might snow again.
It was actually snowing at my house a little bit ago.
Was it really?
Just a couple, just like really light flakes. I was like, oh. It's crazy to me that it's like I don't remember the last time snow stayed on the ground this long.
Yeah.
After kind of a light snow.
It's super cold, and I keep checking my app on my phone. I'm like, when's it gonna snow? And I get so mad when they change it. They're like, 50% chance of snow today. No, 0% chance.
Zero. Yeah, you
but
don't
it's supposed
know
to
anything
snow later this
check
week.
it.
They're saying. I don't know.
Really?
Yeah. You know what's funny? This is
Well,
totally off topic, but I'm noticing
let's
like
hear
if you look at your background, how your books are so nice, and then look at my books in the background. They're just like
mine just look nice because they're full.
Yeah,
they're just
mine are like piled though. You see the
I have a book buying problem. I like books. I read them. I read a lot of books.
I've got the Calvin series there. It's all nice.
Oh yeah, mine's right down here. You can't see it, but it's right down there. Yeah.
Anyways, that's not what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, that's another podcast, the book podcast someday.
Speaking of leather,
yes,
the cows of Bashan.
I was like, what? Oh yeah, that's right. This is the cows of Bashan sermon. And it's funny because this is the second time our church has gone through Amos. It was like I must have been like 9 years ago, maybe more like 15 years ago. It was like 2010.
Do you want to know?
Went through this last. I think it was 2010, but this is the second time I know for certain we've gone through Amos.
Yeah,
and I remember distinctly hearing because it was probably the first time I had really heard cows of Bashan and actually heard somebody explain what it was. You know how you read the Bible and you're kind of like, oh, cows of Bashan. Okay.
Yeah.
Some idiom I don't understand the meaning of, So,
or maybe you do.
Going, oh, the Bible talks that way. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you want to, let's just start with that. It's a bit of, given your sermon, it's understandably, there's a bit of a debate on some of the particulars, but what are the cows of Bashan?
Yeah, this is how Amos starts chapter 4, the cows of Bashan. And the language that in most translations really makes it sound like he's addressing what I called wealthy, wayward women of Israel. And that's that kind of, it leans that way when he brings out the charge, who say to your husbands, bring that we may drink. So on the surface, just like, oh, he's talking about ladies right here. And he's using language that nobody's allowed to use when talking to ladies, because he calls them the cows of Bashan. And if you want to get slapped, call a lady a cow of anything. Right? It's like, so
doesn't matter where it is.
It doesn't matter. But it was a nice town. So what I think he's getting at, or do you want me to get into the commentaries, or
kind of talk about the I guess even if there's two sides of this. One is that they give the two sides and then kind of talk about both of them a little bit.
Yeah, the two sides is that these are wayward, wealthy women in Israel who are self-absorbed. That if you've ever watched cows, they just graze and graze and graze and graze. That's just what they do, right? And so I think that he's referring to their behavior as this constant consuming, and it's always directly connected to the oppression of the poor. So it's through the oppression of the poor that wealth is generated, that they keep consuming, that supports their comfort, that allows them to just be, just completely self-absorbed. And it seems like even the relationship husband and wife, it's completely become the husband exists to make his wife comfortable and live at ease, and don't say anything to disrupt mom and get her whatever she wants, right? So most of the commentators lean towards some version of that. The guy that I quoted, he he went as far as talking about a certain sensual voluptuousness.
Voluptuousness, yes.
Yeah, which is why he referred to the cows. And I was like, I mean, that could be, I don't know. Wasn't going to get there. But the main issues are the grazing like consuming, the oppression of the poor, and the manipulation of the husband. And those things are just kind of on the surface in the text. So most of the actually every commentary I read, with the exception of one, took that angle on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I wanted to talk about sins that are uniquely the unique ways in which women are tempted to sin. Because men and women don't sin in the same way. And anybody who's been a pastor for a half hour is going to figure that out really quick, right? Men and women,
they're so blind they think that women just don't sin.
Maybe they reject the binary. I'm just like, oh, how dare you?
Yeah. Well, it's like, I think that it's funny because I think that, men are really aware of their sin. Because of that, they're less aware of the different sins that women have.
Yeah. And I think, I was going to say, I think that there's a certain like unspoken rule that it's okay to confront men about their sin, but it's not okay to confront women about their sin.
Yeah. And
you feel that the moment you start talking about women and sin, specifically sins that women deal with. So I spent a lot of time going into that in terms of how women and men are tempted to sin in different ways, and that sin at the heart of it is rebellion against our vocation, our primary calling. God has created men and women both in his image, both equal, very different primary orientations in terms of their work in the world and their work in the context of a family. And so you see that Adam was created to protect the garden and to work. And the curse after sin is not that Adam has to work, but that his work becomes toilsome. So his work is kind of working it's back against him. And excuse me. And so consequently, Adam and all men are prone to rebel against that curse. And so the way that men rebel against that calling to work is either you don't work, you're laziness, or the toilsome nature of work makes you angry. And every guy who's ever done a project on his car knows exactly what that is, right? The toilsome nature of it is like, it makes you crazy. And men are confronted with that everywhere they work. Everything is toilsome. Nothing cooperates. It rarely, I love watching YouTube videos on how to do stuff, but no YouTube video. Rarely do they cover the toil part. It's just like, oh, it was great, and you can do this and buy this part. And so men are prone to sin in that way. And if you just said, hey, men are prone to laziness and anger, people are like, well, duh, yeah, like this is obvious. It's plainly true. But women are prone to sin in different ways. And Eve was created with a calling, with an orientation to help Adam, to help her husband. And what that means is that God has given her unique gifts, unique abilities, unique strengths that are very different than Adam's. That's why they bless Adam, because they're different, and it completes the task that God is in called to both of them to be fruitful and to multiply, and that means taking care of households and building and all that stuff. So God has given Eve and all women a different calling, and they relate to their husband differently. Their work is given and done in concert with his to pursue God's calling. So when God addresses Eve and all women in Genesis 3, he says that your desire is going to be to control your husband, but he's going to lead. That's the conflict, because their calling is to help and to contribute, and the temptation is going to be to rebel against that calling and instead control him.
Yep.
And so when you say that, the room will go quiet and every guy will know exactly what you're talking about. Right? Because you're like, yeah, you see this. We're all sinful. We see this stuff in ourselves. And anybody who knows themselves is going to go, yeah, this is true. And so that works itself out in women's lives in different ways. I gave two really general examples because you find them in the New Testament. There's warnings about these things. There's warnings about gossiping and words and multiplying words and using words,
manipulation.
And I will say, I've shared this with a number of women that I respect, and it's like, women get really nasty in relationships with other women. It can get really, really bitter and ugly, and it's just, so women struggle with words, and they struggle with gossip, and they struggle with also being a busybody, and that's the person who's in the middle of everything all of the time, and it's a way to always be in
almost
the
like
know.
Pretending, almost like there's almost this like belief that you're like, by being in the middle, you're like a conductor, because there's like part of that like control aspect, like because I have this knowledge, I can kind of like have some sort of conductive power.
Yeah. And then the other general way that it happens is just through immodest clothing. And Paul, and when he's writing to 1 Timothy, that's in chapter 2, that's what he talks about. Like, men, don't quarrel, don't be given to anger, raise your hands in prayer, and ladies, dress modestly. This is a feminine virtue. It's pleasing to God. I know that you struggle with this because you're struggling. Your sin is, the flesh is fighting against, God's calling and the orientation, but you have to put that to death. You have to be modest and self-controlled in your dress. So, I wanted to say those things because, one, they're true. The text doesn't always lend itself to go there, and it felt like this one did, because Amos is specifically dealing with women. And I thought, we're just gonna go there.
I thought, my wife was appreciative of that. We were talking about it afterwards, and like one of the things you emphasize, and you kind of hinted at it just now, but like, there is a tendency to turn the modesty thing into, like, there's a big revolt that a lot of women have, like that. The modesty command is like, because men lust, so that's why they need to be modest. You know, like, why is his sin my problem? And it's funny because it's not that it's unrelated, but like, you emphasize something that's absolutely true, which is like, no, like, modesty is a feminine virtue that God commends and loves, right? And commands. And my wife and I were talking about that, and she's like, yeah, that's like, that absolutely needs to be like on the forefront of this. But she was like, but sin multiplies. So of course, if someone's disobeying their calling, it's going to result in somebody else's calling. They're sinning. Like, there's an infectious kind of reality to sin. Where if somebody, is sinning in one way, if they're not obeying the call to this feminine virtue of modesty, then that the fruit of that will probably be men who are also sinning in their own manner. So they're connected. And this is you can, it's so simple, but for some reason this issue, it becomes complex. Like, if I'm angry at someone and I punch them, like, the fruit is probably going to be that they will be tempted to sin against me and do something evil to me. Right. And and it's like, okay, so we know this, that's, sin in relationships is infectious, and one person's sin becomes the reason for another person's temptation. Right. And so but it is important to say that this is a virtue to be pursued because God says it is. Period. Expect bad fruit if you don't.
It's just like if you dealt with anger in the same way, like you said, hey, you shouldn't be angry because your anger might cause someone else to be angry. I was like, well, that's actually true. Like, your anger might cause someone else to be angry, but that's not the primary reason
Exactly.
that we're called not to be angry. That's a secondary reason.
Yes.
And the same thing would apply to like immodest clothing. Like if you dress in a way that when you dress immodestly, you're intentionally drawing attention to your physical features. That's what it is.
Yep.
And so when you do that, you shouldn't be surprised if people's eyes are drawn to the features that you're accenting through the clothing that was specifically meant to do that. And so, are there going to be guys who are struggling with lust who that's going to make things difficult for them? Yeah, for sure. But that's not the primary reason that you're instructed not to do it. It's because it glorifies God.
Exactly.
It's your heart and God. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's and I think you even, you hinted at this as well, that there's a kind of like I think there are many reasons why women might dress immodestly, but if it's drawing attention to yourself, it kind of seems like we know, for instance, in Proverbs that there's a particular woman that dresses immodestly because she is seeking to manipulate someone into lusting after her, so she can get what she wants from him.
Yeah,
and that's
control.
not a and that's not to say that that's always the motivation.
Correct.
But it absolutely is one of the motivations. That there's a kind of control, there's a kind of disarming of that very same relationship you mentioned earlier that God put in place for like the husband to lead and rule, and and there's a kind of disarming that can happen when you manipulate in this way. And it's like, it reminds me of like Adam was afraid for some reason to confront his wife about the fruit, right? Well, I wonder why.
Yeah.
It's like, so I think that, because it's really that's one of man's particular sins, is that he abdicates, right? He can easily abdicate. And so man needs to be strong and have fortitude in himself. And that's what he has to focus on, regardless of how modest someone's dressing around him. Right. But the two things are interesting related to that kind of first thing you set up. So that was I don't know how everybody felt about it, but I thought it was refreshing to hear kind of like both things addressed.
Well, it's just Monday. We'll find out here in a couple of days.
Yeah. So let's talk about let me hear you talk about the other side, the Calvin side.
Yeah. So I read Calvin last, and I typically do that. If I make it to Calvin's commentary, it'll be the last one that I read. And so I got to it, and his take was completely different. It was like, oh, this isn't about women at all. He thinks this is about, kind of the advisors and the policymakers who would have been around the ruling class, the king, who are working with business partners and people in the community, and are constantly kind of massaging things so that there's policies that are good for the king and his men, and there's policies that are good for business, and they continue to profit, and they turn a blind eye, and revenue is up, and yet the poor are suffering. So this is kind of like backdoor deals, favors, bought off cops, district attorney manipulation, that kind of a thing. And he argues that the language, it is feminine, but Calvin says it's because Amos refuses to consider these men. It's meant a slight to them. And it's not I think people get hung up with this. When you call a guy a woman, you're not saying women are bad. You're saying it's bad for a man to be a woman.
Exactly.
Just like if you call a woman a man, you're not saying men are bad. You're saying it's wrong for a woman to be a man. That's not what a woman is. That's not what a man is. And so Amos says he's basically calling this kind of inner circle of advisors, policymakers, the backdoor, deals. He's calling them women, refusing to acknowledge that they're even men. And the reference about the husbands bringing a drink, he points out that word that is translated husband is never translated husband in any other of the prophetic scriptures. It's always translated Lord or a ruler, or it's someone who has vested authority. And So he thinks it's a reference to kind of these policymakers calling the people in charge that are getting together, they're having a party while they are, basically ruling in a way that just is breaking the backs of the poor. That was his take on it.
Interesting. I actually, when I heard that, I thought there might actually be a synthesis here, because Calvin is. I think Calvin is probably right, but I think that Calvin is maybe saying these men who are in these positions of, like, self-serving positions, calling the lords to kind of do their bidding, manipulating, doing backdoor deals. They are acting like wayward, wealthy women.
Yeah.
They are acting like they've picked up feminine vices. They're not doing even masculine vices. They picked up feminine vices for themselves. And I find that interesting, because I think that there's a especially they call to the lords for a drink. There's something about that line that makes me go, huh. So you have these people who are doing this, who are like, they're almost functioning in that kind of like, so first off, why do they call them lords? Yeah. Right. Lord is an interesting word, because it's actually it can be a word of flattery. Right.
Yeah.
And it can be done right. Like I thought about how Sarah called Abraham Lord.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And how
I think that's the only time where that's translated that way. Actually, that's the one instance.
And that's New Testament. So it's like, but you have an instance where, these people who want to wheel and deal, why do they call him Lord? Well, it's like there's to me, it seems like they're taking this position of like feminine flattery.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. It's the adulteress with the lips that are sweet as honey.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And they're wheeling and dealing. It could be something like, some quid pro quo going on, like, hey, if you let me skim off the top of that, I'll let you go, whatever, do this thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and so I think that the two can actually be synthesized in a bit, but I think that it's interesting when you think about what happens to a nation when the men stop acting like men and start acting like they have feminine vices, not even the masculine vices.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that you see something very similar. You see a lot of, rather than clear, bold vice, you see a lot of backdoor, a lot of sneaky, weird stuff, a lot of like, flat, like you're not even bold enough to just come out and, say what you are. Right. There's a weird manipulation of things to get what you want.
Yeah.
You're not going to actually exercise you're not going to exercise power. You're going to try to like get power to do your bidding. What I mean? It's like, it's kind of interesting, because I think that there is a bit of that feminine vice in our previous and a lot of current politics. It's kind of, you don't have a lot of bold masculine leadership. I mean, we've been seeing more of it lately, which is refreshing.
Yeah.
But but this kind of like, no one's willing to just call a spade, be clear, because like no one's willing to offend their constituents.
Yeah.
It's like they're just trying to get it all for their own, political benefit.
Yeah.
And it's not that that's a feminine thing. That's a feminine vice.
Yeah.
They are doing.
There's a common thread in terms of like men can manipulate, but they tend to manipulate through strength.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And women manipulate through benefits and words. And so that would be an example of potentially these leaders who are manipulating through the giving of benefits and through smooth words.
Yeah,
for sure.
Kind of interesting.
That's interesting.
Think about that.
Yeah.
So two other points, and I think that we can actually be kind of brief on these. You had talked about the holy places, right? Mm-hmm. And how there was just an awful lot of effort being spent to keep up and go through the motions of these holy places. The Gilgal is one of them, and it is astounding to hear God condemn their, like, just like they're doing all the stuff. So you think, oh, that's good, right? And then it's like, no, like, in fact, in the next chapter, chapter 5, he says he hates them, right?
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a warning there, because you can very easily just kind of go through the motions of things. But what is the point of this emphasis on, you guys have all these holy places, I don't care about them? What is God saying? Like, I don't care if you go to church. Like, what is he saying?
Yeah, I was trying to be careful in the way I said that, because there's you and I probably both grew up and still hear this. It's not about religion; it's relationship. Yeah, and it's like, I understand what the person who says that is trying to communicate, but it communicates, I think, a lot more than what they want it to communicate. And so there's kind of just this general understanding that religion, meaning formal religion, like you go to church, you say your prayers, you sing your songs, you listen to the sermon, you give your money, that's all terrible. And what God wants is this really organic, authentic, unorganized, unstructured, spontaneous, ethically sourced, organic, thing that I don't know where that thing is, but
it's in the head. It's like in the spiritual no man zone.
Yeah, or any type of like understanding that you should do something.
Yes.
Like obedience matters.
Yeah.
So when you say that when religion, like people think you're saying all of this stuff is bad. And it's like, no, that's not what it is. And I think when people say relationship, not religion, that's what they end up inevitably. I think that's how it sounds to people who are outside. Yes. Be like, oh, God doesn't care what I do. I shouldn't go to church. It doesn't matter. I shouldn't, So anyways, there's that craziness. That's not what's happening. That's not what God's talking about here. He's not saying, don't go to worship. And like he's the one that gave ordinance to his people for worship. That's not the problem.
Yep.
The problem was that these things were merely external. And one of the commentators described it in a way that I thought, I didn't say this on Sunday, but I think this is really helpful, that God prescribes different offerings for different kinds of sins and violations, right? And instead of saying, I don't want to offend God, I want to love God, I want to obey him, instead of saying that, they're just saying, well, when I do this, I just have to do this, right? Yeah. Okay, I violated this, and I just have to do this. There was no heart that was like, no, I actually want to honor God, and I want to obey God. And it's kind of like in 1 John where it talks about, and if any of you do sin, right, he talks about Christ as our propitiation, right? And of course we all sin. But John is talking about we are trying to put the flesh to death, and we're waging war against the world within us. And so we're trying not to sin, but we are still going to sin, but we're actively waging war against it. And I think what's happening, what Amos is talking about in chapter 4 is that the war against sin is just completely gone. It just doesn't exist at all. Yeah. There is no true love for God. There's no true love for righteousness. There's no true love for his word. And yet they were doing the things thinking that, well, that's what God wants, right? He wants us just to jump through the hoops, and there was no inward reality whatsoever. So the solution to that wasn't to don't gather and don't have offerings, and it wasn't that. It was to fully engage the heart with God.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is what they were not doing. And as a result, God was going to crush the things that they were doing.
Yeah, it's jumping ahead a little bit, but it becomes clear in chapter 5 that they are they're doing all those things, but they also have a couple other altars they go to as well.
Yes,
like they're faithful to a bunch of altars. So like it's like that, and that reveals something. It reveals, okay, so you're going through the motions here, but there's no your heart is not united there. You're just kind of like, I do this thing, and I go over here and I worship over here this false god, and it's like you are actually operating as the Lord of your
That's right.
There's an autonomous choice happening that, like,
Yeah.
I'm going to do this here, I'm going to do this here, and I'm just going to, I'll cover my bases.
Yeah.
But I'm still kind of in charge here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just reading that today. It was like, do not seek, right? Do not seek Bethel. Don't enter into Gilgal. Don't cross over to Beersheba, which were the places of worship for them. And it's, I think it's kind of like, if you can imagine a married couple that, let's say 15 years ago went to Hawaii, had this really great time, right? And since then, their marriage has become really cold, right? Just no love, no affection, no none of that. And so one of the spouses is like, oh, we just need to go back to Hawaii, right? Without having any like changed heart towards your spouse. It's like, it doesn't work. You can't just go back to these places that, and for, Bethel was a significant place in the history of Israel. Like that is where Jacob had the vision, and he saw the ladder connecting heaven and earth and the angels ascending and descending. Like, this is an important place, but you need more than to go back to the important place. You need to go back to God. And that's what was that was just missing entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. Holy, I think you said something like holy places don't make holy people, or something like God doesn't want holy places. He wants holy people, or something like that.
Yeah. It's like, going to a holy place doesn't automatically make you a holy person. Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Because they were doing the stuff, but there was no heart.
And I taught on something recently similar about this at the youth community. And I talked about what is basically true devotion look like, right? And it's just so, I remember being a teenager and thinking about, like, it's really easy just to kind of do what you do because you do it, right? And so, like, you need these kind of prophetic words and these like, kind of like wake up moments to be like, wake up. Why are you here? And I'm not telling you to go away, but I'm saying, like, you need to reckon with why you're here. No one else can do that for you. You need to actually engage your heart. You need to examine your heart, and you need to not stop being devoted to God through coming to church and worshiping, but do it with a heart that is in it. Right.
Yep.
So it's a good reminder.
Yes, sir.
This is the last thing we're going to talk about before this episode is over. The gift of discomfort, which I had teased in the last episode. But we didn't really talk about it.
Yep.
Accidentally teased because that sermon was fresh in my mind. The gift of discomfort.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
People don't like the way that sounds.
Yeah. People don't like the way it sounds, but I think if you talk to people one-on-one, everybody has a story that is something like this, right? So after God is giving, he's prosecuting the case, and the second half of chapter 4, he just gives example after example after example of ways that he had tried to get his people's attention. And it goes back to what Amos says, for 3, even for 4, meaning the sins that God is going after are long patterns, deeply established patterns of sin. And all the while, God was intervening, and he was introducing disruption and discomfort to their life. And so you have the whole list of things. It starts with, I gave you clean teeth, which is like you had no food. They
went hungry for a bit.
Yeah, they were hungry. He disrupted weather patterns, so you'd have rain over here and not over here, and so you'd have to go travel to get water. He talks about disrupting the crops with blight and mildew, and then sending pestilence like that of Egypt. And that part, the Egypt reference there, I think is super, like, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
And after that, it says, I killed your young men with the sword, right after mentioning Egypt, which is like, that's what happened when they left. And so all of that stuff is God basically saying, I've been trying to wake you up, and I started with gentle nudges, like, you're hungry and the crops aren't doing well, and that escalated to pestilence and loss of life and tragedy, and it was repeated over and over and over again, yet you did not return to me. And so each one of these discomforts, which then grow into these tragedies, each one of them was meant to awaken Israel to return to him, to come back to their first love, to come back to God. And so I was talking about that's the way that, I mean, what he's talking about in chapter 4 is on a national level. These are like the whole community, right? All the northern 12 tribes or the southern 2. But God also does that in very personal, individual ways, where God will just keep disrupting your life and introducing disappointment, and sometimes that grows, and sometimes that's health, and sometimes that's major loss. And along the way, you just, you feel like God's opposing you and he's against you, and why is he doing this? But God is ultimately sending those things to wake us up and to get our attention, and to say, the way that you're headed is not good, and this is not going to lead to life, and you need to come back to me. And there's that famous C.S. Lewis quote about God shouting to us in pain, that it's often when we suffer that we cry out to God. And it's like, you could talk to so many people, that's their story, and they will all tell you the same thing. They don't really want to go back to that pain and experience it again, but they also wouldn't change it, because that was the thing that God used to wake them up.
Yes,
to awaken them.
It's interesting how, there's, I'm thinking about Romans 8, right? And Romans 8 talks about how, everything that you suffer, even God will work for your good.
Yeah.
Right. And there's kind of two different angles on that. And the one is the one you just talked about. Like God sends us things to wake us up because we're asleep. Like, our foot is on the gas pedal. We're driving towards a cliff of judgment. Right.
Yeah.
And then God also sends us things when, I'm thinking about Job, like Job, in the beginning of Job starts with God saying, look at Job.
Mm-hmm.
Look how upright and blameless he is.
Yeah.
I'm proud of this guy. I'm proud of this. Like, yes, Job was a sinner. He wasn't just like all of us, but he was somebody who was faithful in his devotion to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He was somebody who was pursuing obedience and was doing, actually, he would have been a model for the people around him of somebody doing that. And yet God allows, Satan to come in and prove that he's not doing this just out of because God had given him such a sweet, crib and like a hedge around him.
Right.
And then, he comes back because after he just, he loses his kids and he loses a lot of his property and his animals and stuff. And, he still blesses God. And then he says, well, you just got to let me get to his body. And then it sends the boils. And then interestingly, after this, it's like you have these three friends who I think actually are a kind of like manifestation of that same accuser coming in. The same accuser is like just trying to push his buttons to get him to curse God, or to get him to abandon his blessing God, coming in and accusing him in a kind of conspiratorial way. And it's like the trial just continues with these guys. And even all that, just the story of Job is crazy because of how it starts, but also how it ends. And it's like God was actually going to using this discomfort, this extreme discomfort. Like, well, I think all of us are afraid God would ever be that proud of us to send us something like that. He sends this extreme discomfort. And yes, there are things that Job says in his responses that he admits that he was wrong to say, but and specifically about demanding an answer from God. That's the one thing that he takes back, as I shouldn't have said that. Like as though he was owed an answer. And at the end, God says, Job did right.
Yeah.
Job did right, and then he multiplies everything he had. Everything gets doubled, and it's interesting because there's a similarity between Job here and Jesus. Like Jesus suffered a ton, and that discomfort was his. I think you may have mentioned this in your sermon, or I heard it recently somewhere. Like the childbirth is discomfort, right? But it's through that discomfort that you get a child. Well, there's language, I think, in Isaiah that talks about how Christ will see the fruit of his travail.
Yeah.
And the word for travail there is like labor pains, and he will be satisfied. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which that's true for, the amazing thing there is that we are the fruit of his travail. He's satisfied that he gained us through his blood being shed to the glory of the Father. But there's a sense in which that can be true of, on the other side, when you're suffering because God's like calling you to repentance, but also like sometimes you suffer and you're just trying to understand what God is doing. Right. And there's I have to have faith in those moments that, I will, if I trust in God, I will see the fruit of this travail, and I will be happy with it. And that's been my experience. Like I've gone through stuff like, man, God matured me in that season in ways I needed to be matured. I didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the discomfort cuts in different directions
for sure. But in
Romans
both
8,
cases, it's a gift.
It is,
right?
Absolutely.
It's a gift.
Absolutely.
And it's a difficult gift, but it's good.
It is. Yeah. Well, that's a good note to leave on, I think.
All right,
everybody. Thank you for listening to Sermon B-Sides. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. See ya.
Adios.